Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Leadbitter. I work for the North Pennines AONB partnership in Northern England, and I'm hosting this session today. The session is called Peatland Restoration and Climate Change Mitigation Challenge. It's in cooperation with Eurosite and the North Pennines AONB partnership, who I work for. What I'm going to do is just give you a quick introduction, really who I am, what we do up here in Northern England in terms of peatlands, and set the scene as to what we're going to talk about today. So first thing is all this fuss COP26 about peatlands. A lot of us have been doing this work for many, many years, but it's good to think about why peatlands are important and review that again. And I do this every time because we often forget the multiple benefits. So the first thing is these peatlands in my patch called Blanket Bog is important for biodiversity reasons. These things are the rainforests of the UK. So they're very important as a habitat, internationally important and protected. Obviously, a big issue right now is carbon in the atmosphere, and peatlands have a massive role to play in that, whether it's actually with damaged peatlands being a source of it or healthy peatlands being a store of it. And that's a lot of what COP26 is about. Up in my neck of the woods, watercolor is a big deal. The water in the streams looks a bit like whiskey. People don't like to drink whiskey-colored water from their tap. So millions of pounds are spent each year trying to remove that because unhealthy, damaged peatlands release water into the systems. It has to be removed before you can drink it. Related to that is sediment loading. That would be larger pieces of peat that get into the water systems, which have issues with fish habitats and things like that. And then water supply. And 70% of all the drinking water in this country comes from peat-covered catchments. If we want to have drinking water and water supply in the future, we need to take care of our peatlands. And then related to that is flooding. If you have damaged peatlands, they tend to be peakier or flashier during rain events and can contribute to flooding. So healthy peatlands are seen as a natural flood management technique that we use in England and Scotland. Historical record, this is one that often gets overlooked. These peatlands are started forming about 8,000 years ago, and they have a record of the historical environment up to 8,000 years ago. So things like pollen, or one day we're going to find a gold sword in a piece of peat up here, I'm sure of it. But the historical record is very important in terms of something peatlands provide to society. And then finally, is the economy. There's an economy for tourism, economy for grouse shooting up here, economies for all sorts of things that peatlands provide. So it's a large economic driver, especially in rural areas. And I've been doing this work for quite a few years now. One thing that I start to put in my presentations, and the most important thing really, and it ties in today and what's going on in the news today, is this. We do it for the future generations. These are my children from a few years ago now, but they know what I do, and they know that we're trying to use peatlands to help provide a more sustainable futures for them. So the North Pennines, where is it? This is basically where we are. In north of England, northeast England, we're in four counties. The top of the area would be Hadrian's Wall, roughly. The bottom would be North Yorkshire. To the east would be Durham. To the west would be Carlisle, if you know the area that well. That blue area is the peatland body in the North Pennines. It's about 1,000 square kilometers upland peat, largest contiguous upland bog in England. That's what we did to it after World War II. We cut 10,000 kilometers of drains in it to try and dry it, to make it more profitable for grasses and things like that, so we could have more sheep on it. It's left a legacy of damaged and drying peat. This is the eroding peat that has subsequently formed because of the drainage and because peatlands do get overmanaged sometimes. And once they start eroding, they tend not to fix themselves. So that leads to this. This is an example of a site that we restored last year, or a few years ago. And you can see the complex here of the water that's flowing through it. You can see how it's all eroding. It's quite complicated. It's quite time consuming, and it takes a lot of effort to fix these peatlands. So if we keep them in good nick in the first place, we wouldn't have to restore them. That being said, we've got about 10, 20 years worth of restoration work ahead of us to get all the peatlands restored up here. So how did we get here? Some of the things that we have done as an AONB partnership, and in partnership with lots of people on the call today, on the presentations today, and I'll discuss that a little bit just quickly. So in the AONB, since 2006, we've restored 40,000 hectares of peat. I'm told that's an area 3 times the size of Paris. So in terms of scale, it's quite large, and we have that much to do still, we think. We've raised about £20 million for peatland restoration with partners, with agencies, with all the people we work with over the past 15 or so years. We are currently a lead partner in a project called Pennine Peat Life, which there is in the pavilion. There is a Pennine Peat Life room in the virtual pavilion. So we're the lead partner on that. We are partners with the Carbon Connects project, the Interreg project, and some of the speakers today from the Care-Peat project, which is the sister project. We are also involved with the IUCN Peatland program, the steering group, which brought together all of the Peatland projects in the UK together in the 4 countries over the past 10 years and pulled us together to act in a more coordinated way to share results, practices, efforts, etc. We're also a member of Eurosite, who I'm hosting this with today, and we have been for a few years now. And that's very important. It's provided lots of connections internationally, and I really believe the need to connect with other people, other projects. As part of my involvement in that, I was asked to develop a peatland restoration working group, which meets 4 times a year, which I chair on behalf of Eurosite. And some of the people today you're hearing from are in that group too, from the Care-Peat project. So this idea of linking up with other people is extremely important. And as we sit here at COP26, you can see the world coming together doing that kind of thing. We're also a Global Peatland Initiative member, which I'm sure many of you are. This is something that I met Diana Kapansky a few years ago, and we became a member, and that has really opened our eyes to the international things that are going on. Again, the linking between the things we do and other people. So I think it's very important to link up, see the big picture of what we do. And then we're also a founding member of something called the Great North Bog Initiative, and I'll spend 30 seconds on this in a minute, but that's something in the UK, the north of England, we are coming together as 6 peat partnerships to try and promote the importance of peat across the UK and hold it up as an example of something that we can demonstrate across the planet and say, look, this is a big ecosystem and these are the organizations working together to restore it. So connections, I'm very keen on this. People say, what do I do for a living? I fix peat, but I also connect. I try to connect thoughts, try to find things that look for things in common. How can we work with people? Because there's power together, and I strongly believe in that. So we try to connect at the local, to the national, to the international level, and that's everything from working with 8-year-old kids at schools to working with ministers to come out and see some of our restoration works and everything in between. And obviously the importance in our area is working with landowners too, who own the land as it's privately held. So just the last thing here, the Great North Bog I want to talk about just quickly, and that is, you can see the map there, the Peak District in the south to the Scottish border, Northumberland in the north, and everything in between. We're working together as a coalition of interested peat partnerships, pulling together really our resources, our expertise, and our voice to try and develop a 20-year funding plan for £200 million to restore that bit of peat. It's a large majority of the blanket bog in England, and we want to restore it over the next 20 years. So with that in mind, I just want to say that again, how important it's been for me to, as a chair of the Peatland Restoration Working Group, to work with the people that are in the room today and some of the people that are speaking today to push the agenda along to help us develop better techniques and better methods of doing this kind of work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just quickly go over what we're going to talk about today. We've got four speakers, guest speakers, and then we've got Wojtek from Eurosite who's going to end the session. We're going to have some questions on that. So that's what it looks like in terms of how we're going the order of operations today. So with that in mind, what I'll do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute, and I'm going to pass it over to Niall and just introduce you to him. Niall Brolcháin is the policy lead for the EU Care-Peat project and has been interested in peatlands and wetlands for decades. He was the vice chair of the Western District River Basin Management Project in the west of Ireland, the chair of the Environmental Strategic Policy Committee, and the chair of the Natural Environment and Waterways Committee in Galway. He now works as a lecturer and researcher at the National University of Ireland in Galway, specializing in evidence-based public policy at all levels, from local to the global. So with that, I'd like to introduce Niall and ask him to present.
Very good. Paul, can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you.
And I don't know, you might let me know when my slides are up, but you probably didn't know that I used to live in Carlisle many years ago, not too far away from you.
No, I didn't know that.
I used to love going along Hadrian's Wall. The Romans, of course, built the roads in straight lines, and I thought it was a wonderful road to drive on. Do you know the road beside the wall, which goes
Yes,
up and
yeah,
down? It's
absolutely.
amazing. I mean, these days roads go with the contours of the land, but in those days they literally went up and down, and it's an extraordinary road. Anyway, you were talking about connections, and I very much agree with that. I think it's hugely important, and I think that the you showed a picture of your children, very fine-looking young people there, or were. I presume it's an older one, from what you said. But it is about actually planning for the future, what we're all doing, and the connections are hugely important. So I'm going to talk to you about peatland restoration policy. In relation to, I suppose, the context of the Eurosite PRMG. So let me see, can I share my slides? Can you see my slides? You can. Right. So the contents of my discussion today are an overview of global peatland policy. I want to tell you a couple of little stories, just working on a CAP position paper and the collaborations we had in relation to that. Again, at an Irish level, peatland restoration, and again, the collaborations in relation to that. I want to tell you a little bit about white paper that various of us are involved in relation to peatland carbon credits, and then a little bit about carbon farming policy, and then the conclusions that we've drawn from some of this. So many of you will be familiar with many of these policies, many of the people listening, and hopefully in a much wider context, people are going to become familiar with these in the years ahead. But obviously the European Green Deal is hugely important, from a whole load of ecosystems points of view and from a climate point of view. But the Global Peatlands Initiative now is very much related to the Peatland Pavilion there in COP26. So from a carbon point of view, that and perhaps the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration are some of the most important policies. But at a European level, there's many relevant policies. I personally think that the Common Agricultural Policy is something that isn't quite right from the point of view of peatlands. I think we've got to work to get it right, but it is moving in the right direction, and we'll discuss a little bit about that later, if that's okay. Next slide. So the big picture, obviously I'm with the Interreg Northwest Europe project Care-Peat, and as you said, I'm working on the policy side very much. A lot of collaboration across 5 different countries. And the big ticket picture really is that re-wetting bogs can save up to 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now we're looking at it in the European context. It's roughly the same in the European Union as a whole, and those figures are obviously calculated including the UK. So we'd love to have you back, I think, but that's another day's work. Certainly happy to come to the COP next week in Scotland. Right, I just wanted to show you just some of this work we actually did. We did some policy discussions with stakeholders in Ireland and with the other 4 countries in Care-Peat. And this is what we came up with. And there's a fair degree of uniformity across countries as to the different requirements that people have in terms of peatlands. So we found that policy gaps, that in Ireland now there's no national carbon credits framework for peatlands. In the UK there is. In Germany there has been regional experience. In the Netherlands there is a national framework. And we believe that the European Commission is very much in favour of such frameworks being put in place in all member states. So hopefully that will happen over the next few years, because that's how we're going to really be able to get a very large scale uptake in terms of peatland restoration. So education, people always feel is important in relation to peatlands, because not many people are familiar with rainforests. They're familiar with issues like flying in aeroplanes relating to carbon loss and so on. But people, in countries like Ireland don't overall really know the extent of the value of peatlands in terms of carbon storage. And, I think when you tell people, people get quite shocked, and they get quite fascinated by peatland, because many people in Ireland believe that peat is kind of a bad land and not very valuable. But in fact, over the forthcoming years, I believe that peat is going to be seen as one of the saviors of of everything in terms of land use. So the third point, I suppose, in terms of policy gap is facilitating local landowner rewetting. Now, the barriers, lack of financial incentives is something that most countries find, and its lack of accessibility to finance really is the key issue. So there's many enablers as well of growth, and very much community was the focus across many of the countries involved. Just onto the story of the CAP position paper. So we identified that a lot of peatland obviously is farmland, and a lot of the land is owned by farmers, even if it's not actually designated as farmland. So we put a lot of effort. A lot of different groups put a lot of effort into the Common Agricultural Policy, and there has been movement there. But the three key demands of the joint CAP position paper that all these organisations put together was the eligibility of farmed wet peatlands for payments, the phasing out of CAP payments for drained peatlands. And just to be clear, we're talking about phasing out. There was a lot of I suppose pushback against that statement, because farmers would tend to be people who quite often experience that governments come in with the stick rather than the carrot, and that their payments would be phased out without other ones being put in place. But that's certainly not the view that we had. It's a phasing out situation, and hugely important to put results-based schemes in place, actual environmental schemes. So those do tend to work very well when they're properly managed. So they're something we would very much encourage. And so the interesting point, I suppose, that we made was the potential of peatlands in Europe, because the European Union, 3% rewetting of agricultural lands can actually reduce agricultural emissions by up to 25%. That, just to get your head around that, that's quite an enormous thing. We're hearing huge debate about methane reduction at the moment, and peatlands obviously aren't going to reduce methane in the short term, peatland rewetting, but in the longer term, to by 2050, simply to rewet and restore 3% of the land area, the agricultural land in Europe, to get 25% cut in emissions. It's really is low-hanging fruit, and it's something that all governments should be getting behind straight away. But the difficulty, of course, we put these proposals forward, and then the Commission waters them down slightly, pardon the pun, and then the Parliament waters that down again. And by the time it gets to the Council, of course, it's actually turned around 180 degrees, and they also kick it down the road to 2025. So, that's just an example. I love this piece of paper because it kind of shows just how tricky it is, to sort of get good policy actually in place. But thankfully, our great friend, Franz Timmermans, came up with this particular statement after the CAP was put in place. And, it has very much, the Commission has always been very supportive, under the Green Deal. And I just want to read you what he said. He said, in the next years, we will protect wetlands and peatlands, dedicate more farmland to biodiversity, boost organic farming, open up new income sources for farmers via carbon farming, and begin to redress inequalities in the distribution of income support. That really is, in my view, a hugely important statement. It was made on the 25th of June, and I thoroughly believe, with the huge finances behind the Green New Deal and the the clout of the people who are making that decision and that statement, it is going to happen. Right, I want to move on because just to show you that this situation, unfortunately, a certain amount of peatland was lost between 2000 and 2018. And as you can see, the bulk of it was actually in Ireland, over 400 square kilometres. And this is not something which I would take much national pride in. But it's moved on a lot since then, even in the short time since 2018. The National Peatland Strategy is very good. New government in place. A lot of us put a lot of efforts into informing that government and indeed getting a lot of movement in terms of peatland restoration. So on the 24th of November 2020, the Cabinet approved 108 million funding for a groundbreaking Bord-na-Mona bog rehabilitation plan. And what's great about that is it's actually a sort of double gain, because Bord-na-Mona previously was ripping up the bogs in order to put them into, to feed the turf into power stations, and in order to, sell it off for horticultural uses. Now they've stopped all the horticultural use, which has had a side effect, unfortunately, that a certain amount of peat gets imported from Latvia in Ireland, which is a bit of an insanity. But nevertheless, that will hopefully be sorted out very soon. But the power stations have stopped, and in fact, Bord-na-Mona is now, rather than ripping up the peat, it's actually restoring it. So they're just some of the sites which are currently being restored in Ireland, and the number of dots on that map is going to grow over the coming years. Certainly, the Care-Peat project is involved in a number of those. So onto the white paper, just a quick view of the white paper, which is going to help facilitate peatland restoration as far as I'm concerned. Basically, what we're doing is it's an outline of a suitable carbon and blue credit certification scheme. Blue credit refers to water. So there is value in a number of different ways from water, and apologies about a bit of background noise there. So the white paper aims to provide a baseline document to outline of a framework to support rewetting and peatland restoration. So quick word on carbon credits. This is just one example of how they potentially can work. Farmers decide to restore some peatland. It's certified, it's approved. The finance actually comes from the fact that there's offsets made as a result of a family going away on holidays, and indeed other people on an aeroplane too. And that money is given back to the farmer for the work they do. So that's kind of a simplistic way of looking at carbon credits. And obviously, you'd be talking about other people, polluting companies which pollute, donating money towards the restoration of peatlands. Is that a good thing? So there's a lot of debate on that. Obviously, it only works if the offsetting has a certain degree of ethics to it. Obviously, it can't be seen as a license to pollute. So just what is a carbon credit? It's a unit of measurement. 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent is removed from the atmosphere. And so trade in carbon credits enables the buyer to offset greenhouse gas emissions and the seller to finance the changes they need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I might be running out of time here, Paul, am I? Yeah, okay.
You got 3 minutes left.
3 minutes left, I'll motor. So very quickly, there's a mandatory trade system, which is normally about governments, and the voluntary system is the one we're more concerned about. This is an important point about the paper, the paradox of additionality, as we've dubbed it. And basically, peatland destruction is sometimes awarded by additionality, but conservation is not. That's a hard one to get your head around. But the two farmers, one who keeps their land in pristine condition, another one who makes a lot of money by selling off their peat, and then they get paid to restore it again. Not ideal, and it is a paradox. It needs to be resolved. Okay, additional incentives, incorporating ecosystem services in carbon credits and creating a separate blue credit system. We feel that it's better to build on the carbon credit system. That's a quick, integrated map of an integrated blue credits and carbon credit system. And finally, just a quick word on carbon farming. In 2021, the European Commission will launch a carbon farming initiative to reward climate-friendly practices. That's in the Farm to Fork strategy. Just the 2 points we had looked at in our policy, that farming in the EU is heavily subsidized, but we would look for subsidy equalization in relation to carbon farming to ensure that it's very much viable. We've developed a carbon farming model. I'm not going to go into it because we don't have time. And finally, carbon farming framework. The European Commission is going to develop a regulatory framework for certifying carbon removals to verify their authenticity. So that's in the Circular Economy Action Plan. These are the conclusions. Again, we don't have time to go into them, but just to talk about 1 or 2 things. We'd look at the guest model particularly is one that we've examined in detail, and it's an easy and cheap accreditation system, which is very much needed. So that is one of the big issues, actually, is you know, the value of accreditation systems. So thank you very much, and we'll move on with the show.
Thanks very much, Niall. We're going to take questions at the end, so please type in the questions, and I'll get to those when we're finished. Okay, so our next speaker is not actually here, but he's sent something in for us to watch. He's pre-recorded presentation. His name is Chris Field. Chris Field's research focuses on the plant and soil responses to nitrogen pollution and environmental change. He collaborates with NGOs and conservation authorities by providing underpinning evidence on the risks to biodiversity from air pollution and the development of new practices for upland and lowland peatland restoration. Chris is currently leading on the work package for the ERDF-funded Care-Peat project. Chris is also lead author of the chapter on mires, bogs, and fens in the CCE review of critical loads for nitrogen nutrients. So with that, I'll ask to have his presentation turned on, please.
Hello, my name's Chris Field. I'm a work package coordinator on the EU-funded, Interreg-funded Care-Peat project, which is a collaboration between all the organisations you can see on the bottom. Our role within the project is to coordinate the restoration planning across the partners and also the monitoring programme in collaboration with our colleagues. Care-Peat covers 9 pilot sites across 5 countries: Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Ireland and the UK, which we've got 3 pilot sites in the UK, 2 in England and a new one in North Wales. The total budget is about 7 million euros. The overall objective of the or goal of the project is to reduce carbon emissions and to restore the carbon storage capacity of different types of lowland peatland. And to achieve that, we've got 3 broad objectives. The first one is to develop reliable measuring methods and to link those with predictive models of carbon fluxes, so we can help landowners make decisions on the best way and to restore different peatlands. That information then feeds into a socioeconomic work package, which is working closely with land users, end users such as farmers and also policymakers to promote peatland restoration. And then finally, we want to be able to sort of develop a toolkit that demonstrates the different methods and techniques that we've employed throughout the project and make that available to other projects and land managers across Europe. Here's sort of some pictures of some of our pilot sites. We've got Cluncrow Bog in Ireland, which is a sort of a shrub-dominated and drained bog that we're re-wetting. Our colleagues in Ireland are re-wetting. There's also a further extracted peatland site in Ireland, which resembles the one this UK site. In Belgium, we've got a number of peatland sites along the valley of the Black Creek, which are drained and degraded peatlands, which are currently grassland. So in Belgium, we're re-wetting a series of these peatlands. In the Netherlands, we've got a really interesting pilot site, which is to sort of restore some former peat pits that have been terrestrialised, and as in this particular area, the water table is controlled regionally, and the terrestrialisation process means that actually a lot of here you can see sort of a before scenario with the trees. The land actually sits above the water table, and because we can't lift the water table up, we've had to lower the land back under the water. So the vegetation on this particular site here, you can see with the digger on, has been stripped, and along with the top layer of peat, it's been pulped, and it's actually been piped several kilometres to a nearby lake, where it's been pumped into a foreshore area. And from one area of degraded peat that was losing carbon, we've created 2 areas that are in a rapid sort of building carbon sequestration phase. We've also got La Gouette peatland in France. This is a lowland sort of poor fen, which is degraded through drainage, and also it suffers from a lot of linear encroachment. And the pilot there is to reintroduce large areas of sphagnum moss to the site. And then we've got 2 UK pilots which are currently underway. One, a carbon farm with Marley Moss, and another, an extracted peatland at Little Walden Moss. And I'll talk about these 2 sites in a little bit more detail during this talk. We also have another peatland in Brittany, and also we've just taken on board a wet woodland in North Wales. So the first of the UK pilots is called With Marley Moss, and we're calling it a carbon farm, and that is we're trying to farm carbon from the atmosphere into the soil. The business as usual, or the control scenario before we started the experiment or the pilot, was that it's a drained agricultural peatland. You can just about see some sheep in the background here on this photo, and so it's grazed. There's a large ditch running down the side of it, and then just to the side of this ditch we've got a conservation lowland raised bog peatland. To convert this peatland into our carbon farm, we stripped off the top layer of peat, which was quite high in nutrients. Also, it had been fertilised, and it had also been limed, so the pH was a little bit higher. And we've used that peat to fill in the ditches around the site. We've managed to separate this. We've got the control site here, which still remains drained and grazed. And we've separated the hydrology of the site. We've also built a water storage area and an irrigation network that allows us to carefully manage the water table at the site. Last summer, in August 2020, this site is managed by colleagues at Lancashire Wildlife Trust, and we work in collaboration with an SME company called Moss, who provide the sphagnum. Last summer, we planted up 150,000 of these sphagnum plugs at the site, so you can see there's quite a lot of. It's real. The rationale with this is, can we achieve much higher rates of carbon storage than we would do if we restored the site conventionally? So we're using very careful control of the water table through an irrigation network that manages the water table within the sort of top 10 to keep it around about 10 centimetres below the surface. So we have oxidation of methane, but also we minimise CO2 losses. And also one of the key objectives of this pilot was to, by filling this ditch that separates the conservation site and the agricultural peatland, we actually raise the water table on the conservation site as well, so we get a double benefit. And I guess the overall objective for us is, we're exploring if we can provide a sustainable future for lowland farmers on peat, as opposed to the sort of conventional draining and grazing on lowland agricultural peatland. So this is an overview of the site taken from a drone flown by Lancashire Wildlife Trust, and the site itself it's about 200 metres long and 100 metres wide, and it's separated into 8 cells, which you can see on this schematic. The top 6 have been planted with sphagnum moss, and the bottom 2 with Phragmites, which the objective of that was to see if we can use the reed to reduce the nutrient levels within the moss, within the peatland, and then also to filter and clean any water before it leaves the site. There's a water collection area off camera at the top, just at the bottom left, and then that feeds using solar powered pumps these irrigation channels. We've got a weather station here, which you can just see in the photo, in the large photo, and then the yellow dots represent the greenhouse gas monitoring locations. So we've got collars in place, 6 of them on the carbon farm area, and then 6 on the controlled agricultural and controlled grazed grassland that you can see in the distance. In fact, the whole site is surrounded by drained and grazed peatland. We're also monitoring aquatic fluxes, or have recently started doing so, so we can consider that component of the carbon budget. And then we also have a V-notch weir at the bottom where we're sampling water for dissolved organic carbon. So some initial growth results over the last year at the site. So you can see from these 2 pictures here, we've got the sphagnum plugs as they went in September 2020, and then what they look like last month. So across the site, the mean cover when they first went in was about 4.5%, and then the mean cover last month was 24%. In actual fact, we've had some really good growth in October. It's been quite warm and very wet, and we've had about another 4 or 5% growth on average across the plots. Nevertheless, it's not been quite as successful as we wanted. A previous pilot on another peatland, we managed to achieve sort of canopy closure of the sphagnum within about sort of 7 or 8 months. So we haven't managed to do that here, but we hope that that will happen in the next growing season. Part of the reason for that was actually a problem with a drought we had in the spring of 2021. So the overall rainfall last year was about the annual average of the last 20 years. However, most of that rain arrived in the winter, and then we had a really dry April, which caused, and then also a dry sort of summer as well. So you can sort of see this is our growth curve looking at the sort of the cover of sphagnum within our colours. But we had quite good initial growth last sort of winter, and then it really leveled out throughout the spring, where we sort of struggled with water availability. So a lot of the site was, it wasn't as wet as we wanted to keep it. Once we got a bit of rain again in the summer, the growth accelerates, and then it plateaued again, sort of between August and September, when the weather was also dry. We've put in place, we've actually enlarged the water storage area at the top of the site, so we're hoping we're better placed next year to overcome any drought if the same weather patterns occur, and also the sphagnum moss itself is much more established than it was last year, so we're hoping as well that also helps mediate the water table at a very local level. So we've been measuring the carbon balance at the site now for about a year during this establishment phase. We use a Los Gatos greenhouse gas analyzer, and this is a closed system where we have actually we've got a chamber. We've also got an extension collar, extension collars of different sizes depending on the vegetation. We record light, peak temperature, air temperature, and also soil moisture and water table. In this process, we measure net ecosystem exchange of carbon dioxide. So this is when, with the sort of cover off the chamber, we're looking at the balance between photosynthesis and ecosystem respiration. Methane obviously is going on all the time independently of light. We do the measurements in the light, which gives us a top term in this equation, and then also by covering it, we repeat the measurements in the dark, and we get net ecosystem respiration. So this is when there's and then by subtraction we can work out what gross primary productivity or photosynthesis is. So some initial results from the site. This first graph shows net ecosystem exchange, and as you can see, actually the grazed pasture, the grassland, is actually growing really strongly in the summer months. Obviously grass grows a lot faster than sphagnum moss, which is a really sort of a slow growing species, especially as it's established in the last year. However, when we look at net ecosystem respiration, the situation is reversed, and actually the grazed pasture emits much more carbon than the carbon farm or the sphagnum moss in the re-wetted part of the site. Obviously net ecosystem exchange on balance is still positive, so it's the grazed pasture is still taking up carbon when we actually make the measurements. However, these are chamber measurements recorded between sort of 10 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, where we've got really good light levels, and it sort of represents what's happening at that particular time. As we get towards, as the light levels are lower in the morning, and also in the evening, when we sort of head through dusk and into darkness overnight, then actually we need to remember that the net ecosystem respiration becomes a very dominating flux, and that continues to happen even when we're not having any carbon uptake during daylight hours. Methane at the site was really low, even multiplying it by 28. These fluxes are a really small proportion of the overall carbon balance. The pasture itself emitted a bit of methane during the winter, but then in the drier months that methane has been oxidised to CO2 before it's got to the surface. The carbon farm, we have very little or no methane emissions throughout the year. So if we work those chamber measurements up into a carbon budget by interpolating the data and building relationships between key environmental variables, and then using the weather station data to extrapolate those measurements over a year, then actually at the moment both sites are emitters of carbon, they're net carbon sources. The grazed pasture emits around 22 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year, and the carbon farm around 2 tonnes. This sort of figure seems to fit well with other model data out there for sort of drained grazed peatland. And I should say, actually, we recorded the gases, made another greenhouse gas visit last month, and for the first time we noted that the site was, at the time of the measurement, that the carbon farm was actually a carbon sink. So that's quite an exciting turning point in the project, and yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that sort of carbon sink persists as we move further on in the project. So by sort of re-wetting that site, we've reduced most of the carbon emissions from it. We've got to remember, of course, that the site's been fertilised, so when we add nitrogen to a site, we're going to get perhaps a lot of mineralisation of organic matters. It's going to stimulate decomposition. It's also we'll also, as it's fertilised not just by the farmer through addition of fertiliser, but through sheep grazing, then we're likely to get some nitrous oxide emissions, which at the moment we haven't taken into consideration. So that flux is probably a little bit conservative on what the actual values are. And then, as I've said, the carbon farm, this is really sort of the establishment phase of the carbon farm. And we're hoping that this figure will, by this time next year, and that figure will be a sink of carbon. We looked at peat stored within the profile at the site. So the peat depth is about 1.5 metres deep, and there's a stock we estimate at around 700 tonnes of carbon per hectare. And if we look at this rate of emission of 22 tonnes of CO2, if we turn that to carbon, then we get an annual loss of 6 tonnes of carbon. So based on that carbon stock, then there's about 115 years left at the site. So in actual fact, the site, to continue farming the site and managing the site as it is really unsustainable in the long term. In fact, if we look at the peat levels, peat depth compared to the neighbouring sort of lowland raised bog conservation site, then that site's about 3 metres. There's about 3 metres worth of peat. That site was extracted until the 1970s. So in the preceding 40 years, we've lost about just over a metre of peat on the drained grassland. And just to whiz through quickly the second pilot in the UK, we've got a former extractor peatland. So this is a bare peat, and interestingly, it's actually the whole site is being restored to lowland raised bog, but it's surrounded by agricultural peatlands across the broader region. For those not familiar with the area, this site we're looking at is near a place called Earlham, and Manchester, which I'm sure you will be familiar with, is just off this map to the right hand side. This, on Little Walden Moss, we're calling this a companion planting trial, and this is based on observations that even though sphagnum's quite slow to grow, where we did see it growing in sort of projects going back over the last 10 to 15 years, is where it had like a nurse crop, like some juncus or maybe some Eriophrum that was able to offer it a little bit of protection. So we decided to try that approach on Little Walden Moss, and we planted clusters of Eriophrum. So we had 1 Eriophrum vaginatum plant, and then 3 Eriophrum angustifoliums with 3 Beader moss sphagnum plants planted last autumn. And we've seen some really good growth since the site was revegetated. This is just after the plants were planted in May 2020, and then, well, we've got 17 months growth on here. Actually, I've just realised it's probably, what's that, about 15 months growth. And when we look at August 2021, then we've had some really good growth. With some the Eriophrum angustifolium has spread sort of rhizomes across the site, and we've seen lots of natural recolonisation from those initial clusters, to the point where we have about 49% cover. We do keep an area bare, which is our control site, just off camera, so we can contrast the carbon savings or benefits at the site. Sagnum itself has sort of grown well where it's most protected, but it has struggled in others. It's really poor quality extracted peat. I think it's probably a little bit early in the sort of ecosystem establishment phase. So we're going to replant some sphagnum, a second phase of sphagnum later in the project. And then if we look at, without going into the same detail as the carbon farm, if we look at the modelling of carbon at the site, then the bare peat area just off camera is emitting about 4 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents per hectare, whereas the vegetated site, we've had a sort of a staggering uptake of about 35 tonnes, just over 35 tonnes. So we're getting a really high saving through this sort of initial establishment phase. That figure is really high compared to what we would expect on a restored bog, and I think that's because the site's having a really rapid vegetation building stage. I think also we've planted the plants really close together, and probably closer together than they would be in the sort of real world. So it might be a little bit artificial. In actual fact, this vegetation growth was so dense that we're struggling to get our greenhouse gas collars on, and have actually relocated as we move on to the sort of second stage of this sort of project. We've recently relocated the greenhouse gas collars to sort of more natural stands, and then actually to try and validate that data, we've taken some biomass samples as well. But the data looks like the initial look at the data suggests that the biomass samples sort of validate the data, these greenhouse gas measurements. Okay, so just to wrap up, Care-Peat is 9 pilot sites across 5 countries with the key objectives of demonstrating restoration techniques across quite a wide variety of lowland peatland types. They're all very different, but across all of them, the common factor is hydrology. We think from early results, and not just in the UK, but also at partner sites across Europe, that actually just by re-wetting the sites, we can eliminate most of the greenhouse gas losses. Perhaps a message for policymakers is that maybe vegetation in the building stage, in the initial establishment phase of a restored peatland, particularly when we're transitioning from bare peat, actually could produce really high carbon dioxide uptake. So maybe we need to perhaps think about emissions factors in these early stages of restoration, because that might also help improve the funding available for restoration projects. And actually, when we've also looking at sort of the economic aspects of this, and we think actually the business case pretty much stacks up as a sort of an alternative land use for farmers on lowland peat, funded through carbon offsetting. Next stage of the project, we're building a predictive model ourselves, led by our colleagues in France, and we're also comparing the results we're achieving with those from the guest set tools and also the UK Peatland Code. We've produced some draft socioeconomic case studies, and in the next stage we're going to work more closely with farmers to try and validate those and to understand how they could sort of carry out these farming practices and what sort of costs they might face to do so on their farms. And then our colleagues at Eurosite are drawing this information together and trying to provide sort of a long-term platform for peatland restoration across Europe. That's it for me. Thank you very much for listening. Just to say, I'm not around today, so I can't answer questions in person, but if you do want to find out a little bit more about the project, or we can send you links to videos we've made at the site, or if you have any questions, just drop me a line at this email address here, and I'll try and answer them as soon as I can. Thank you very much.
I'm very impressed, Chris. You answered, said what I was going to say. So obviously he's not here, but if you have any questions, please get in contact with him or with me, and I get questions to him. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Terry Morley. He's a lecturer at NUI Galway with 20 years experience working with wetlands as an ecologist. He has worked in the private and public sectors in this capacity and is involved currently with several national and European projects involving peatland conservation in Ireland. Terry?
Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you to the organizers of the event and to Eurosite for the session. I'm here to talk about the involvement of Care-Peat in the European management of peatlands and as it relates to the project site here in Ireland. And what I would like to first give everyone a perspective who may not know the issues that we face in Ireland, this kind of a situation that we have here. Peatlands are the second most dominant feature in the Irish landscape, approximately 20% of the land area, with agriculture 60%. For centuries, like many other European countries, peatlands have been extracted first for domestic and then later for large-scale industrial extraction, mostly for fuel. And what remains today is a tiny fraction of once what was. Given that, however, Ireland still has a regionally significant and globally important proportion of raised and blanket bog habitats. And I encourage those of you who are in attendance at the pavilion to take a peek at Ireland in the new global peatlands map that's been put up, I think, yesterday. So the majority of our peatlands are degraded in Ireland and emit more than sequester carbon. And this, as opposed to maybe other places, offers a huge opportunity or capacity for rewetting and emissions mitigation in Ireland. It's estimated that over 10% of national emissions come from the status of these degraded peatlands. It's been estimated that about 16% of bogs remain uncut. And so what does that look like? Again, I want to give you a perspective of a typical Irish landscape here, dominated by agriculture, right? With remnant bog features. Here outlined in red, this is the Cluncrow Bog. This is in the Midlands of Ireland. And outlined in red is the Care-Peat site of Cluncrow Bog. And what you can see here is well, some intact raised bog, but lots of impacts from the former peatland boundary. And if we actually could understand where the former peatland boundary is, we can get even a better perspective of what has been changed. And we can see here that this represents, oddly, about an 84% reduction in the original area. And we have here really a mesocosm of what we've experienced here in Ireland, from domestic cutting in the northeastern section, transformation to farmed agricultural landscapes, and even still today, industrial extraction at large scales. We're able to determine the boundary of these old peatland boundaries because we happened 200 years ago to have had many of our peatlands mapped by surveyors. And it offers a unique ability of us to see or visualize this change in the Irish landscape. Here's areas that are outlined as previous bog conditions in the early 1800s in County Kerry. And if we juxtapose that with current aerial images, we see a near 100% loss in this area of our bog habitats. And this represents a large source of emissions from all these organic soils. Same thing here in Lullymore, a massive peatland landscape that's been industrially changed. So peatlands really are nature's engines to reduce and store carbon. And these engines, I think, currently are not working well. And there's an urgent need to get these carbon engines working better. And that's the message that I like to give to landowners when we talk to them about rewetting. Speaking of which, there are positives in Ireland. This is a map that Niall also showed of current peatland related projects. So there are many, and this is excellent. These projects will be crucial towards furthering our understanding of how important these systems are. And it's reflected in many of the restoration targets that the large landowners have made for Namona, 31,000 hectares, and National Parks and Wildlife Service, and Quailship, which is the state forestry. Lots of planned rewetting. But this actually doesn't get at the largest component of those degraded areas, and that's private landowners. So this is a big issue that we need to work with, is how do we get the private landowners rewetting? So we need a transformation that includes that area. And of course, I'm here today as part of the Care-Peat project, and Niall and Chris have already introduced that, so I'll save you that reintroduction. But I do want to talk about the pilot site that you saw earlier at a much larger scale. Here, zoomed in, is the pilot site. This is a former drained raised bog and cutover bog. It was drained or ditched in, I believe, the 1980s for the horticultural industry, and had only begun to be extracted before it was ceased. This represented a unique opportunity to re-wet and really restore a peatland that also has adjacent active raised bog areas. And so restoration was complete last year, nearly 1,000 peat dams. And because of the exchanges, the international exchanges that we've had with Eurosite and our other partners, we actually added a novel type of cell bunding to the restoration activities. But we know relatively little about the carbon savings capacity of this particular restoration technique in Ireland. And so we've been monitoring and measuring greenhouse gases as part of that. And as Chris has demonstrated, what's unique about the Care-Peat project is that all of the project sites are measuring and monitoring the greenhouse gases using the exact same methodologies, which is of nice benefit. He also mentioned, and I'm going to go further into sort of where we're taking this and where Eurosite is helping us with these collaborations, is trying to scale from the collar, from the level of collar, individual collar measurements to a peatland landscape. And we're doing that through UAV or drone surveys to allow us to provide images of the peatland before and after restoration, linking that with the greenhouse gas models that our French colleagues are doing, and the model comparison across Europe that assesses emissions or uses emission factors based on vegetation type, to then ultimately produce images like this, where we can see where there are hotspots of emissions or reductions across a particular peatland landscape. Now, as I mentioned, the landowner approach is very crucial, and community involvement is central towards conservation, especially in the long term. And so that's why we've teamed with the Irish Peatland Conservation Council and local community groups to involve public and local schools to partake in restoration activities. And these are images of a sphagnum transfer event that was held just earlier this year. And the goal is to have these groups return to the site to monitor the success as a part of a citizen science initiative. And we hope that this will give the communities a greater sense of involvement in the restoration efforts. It also helped to alleviate some of the public landowner concerns about rewetting. Chris mentioned this application of our greenhouse gas models in conjunction with economic analysis that Niall is providing, to then provide on the ground scenarios to particular landowners for how they can utilize their land in a more carbon savings manner. So, and then most importantly for the farmer is an assessment of how that affects their income. So that's forthcoming as part of the project. Our researchers regionally have reassessed the published fluxes across Ireland since the last combined report in 2013. Good news here, a threefold increase in the number of peatlands that have been monitored in Ireland and fluxes measured within the last 8 years. This should increase given the number of new projects that are ongoing. We also, based on this analysis, realize that there is a great need for additional measurements, especially in these grasslands over organic soils. Niall has talked about the European impact, and I would again like to stress the benefit that the European involvement has had with the joint advisory panels, having experts look at our restoration successes and provide comments and a critique of those methods that have been hugely important. The Eurosite Management Group as a platform for local and national and regional organizations to come together to talk about peatland restoration has been very effective. And Niall has talked about the policy briefs. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge our crew on the ground and the other partners involved with the Community Wetlands Forum, the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and the Irish Peatland Conservation Council. Here we have our summary of those talking points. And if I could plug on Wednesday to please tune in to the Peatland policy session, where we have a series of Irish peatland bog fans talking. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Terry. I really like the term carbon engine. I haven't heard that before. I'll be using that. It's very clever stuff. Thank you. Okay, so our next speaker, running a bit behind here, but we have time we can use going into the questions, so don't worry about that. Next speaker is Atisha Derma. She has several years of experience in the coordination of projects for international environmental organizations. She is based in Berlin, working for NABU, which is the largest environmental organization in Germany. She is currently responsible for the coordination, public relations, and policy issues of the project Life Peat Restore and Life Multi-Peat. Atisha?
Yeah, hi. Can you see my presentation and hear me well? Yeah? Okay, so I'm here to give an overview of our project Life Peat Restore, and hopefully, if we have time, I can introduce also our new project, Life Multi-Peat. So today's presentation will be mainly to give an overview of the sites that we've been working with in Life Peat Restore, the main activities, and especially the lessons learned. But just like Paul, I also like to always start by highlighting the importance of peatlands and why we work with them. So Paul already gave a great list of the many points why peatlands are important. I will focus on the climate issue here and the unique feature that peatlands have, that when they are healthy and the water level is at the surface, they act as a great carbon sink. But yet when they are drained, when they are degraded, they become significant sources of carbon. All of the carbon that they have been accumulating for over thousands of years and have been storing there is released into the atmosphere. So that basically explains why we talk almost obsessively about peatlands to anyone who will hear, who will listen to us. And that's why we are trying to raise those water levels and make peatlands wet again. But it may sound sometimes easy, but I'm here to give you an overview to show that there are sometimes lots of obstacles and it's not as easy sometimes. So first, talking about Life Peat Restore, we are 9 partners. We worked in 5 different countries. We are reaching the end of our project. We have restored 5,300 hectares of the degraded peatlands. And the project works in these 3 complementing fronts. You have the first initial stage, which is a lot of data collection, a lot of planning, followed by the actual restoration. And then throughout the project, we are always organizing events, meetings, reaching out to different stakeholders, and basically disseminating the importance of peatlands and its vital role in climate change mitigation. So as I mentioned, the initial stage is planning, lots and lots of planning. You have lots of obstacles to overcome. You have to collect a lot of data, signing agreements with stakeholders, fulfilling a lot of requirements to get the proper licenses, the proper consents to start the actual restoration. This stage can take up to 2 years, sometimes even more, depending on the kind of issues that arise and how difficult the bureaucracy is, the requirements are to get the proper approvals. And it can also be very costly to fulfill these requirements. But only when all the consents, all the plans, all the agreements with stakeholders are done and signed and approved, we actually start with the restoration. As you can see here in the photos, this can vary. A lot of the partners, they use different materials to do the dam building and the trench backfilling. For more information on that, I would recommend to check out our project website. We have just published a book, a practice book that explains in detail all of the restoration techniques that our partners have been implementing. Here, I just wanted to give you an overview. Our project is very large. You can see we worked with a lot of sites, a lot of different peatland types. And I wanted to highlight here also, as you can see, most of them are Natura 2000 sites. So we don't have much time. I will go very quickly. I can't, there's not enough time to go over all of the sites, so I just picked a few with some interesting features. This is in Lithuania. They had 5 sites, our partners, Lithuanian Fund for Nature. They worked very closely with the State Forestry Department, as they, I think in total, removed over 200 hectares of forest. So that's a lot. And then they also worked closely with a peat mining company because one of their sites was a heavily exploited site. And here is a good example of how sometimes we, for restoration, one of the challenges, one of the vulnerabilities that they have is that depending on the weather conditions, if you have a drought, it will have a very negative impact on the success of the restoration measures. In this case, they did some sphagnum spreading, and they had to repeat it the next year because it all died due to droughts. So that's one. And then you have also Estonia. In Estonia, our partners, Peatland University, they had the largest site. So they restored over 3,000 hectares. They built hundreds of dams, all using peat, all made out of peat, no artificial material. They did a lot of forest removal too. But here, the interesting thing that they came up with in the planning, which really delayed the implementation of the restoration, was that there was one ditch that was so large that it was used by a protected fish species. And here, there was a compromise that our partners had to find with the local authority because they couldn't close that ditch. So that's just one example of sometimes how national regulations, they can here it resulted that they gave priority to the protected species and not the protected ecosystem. And then finally, you have another site that showcases, the difficulty or the challenges sometimes with heavily exploited peatland areas that have been then covered by a shallow water body. And here, our Polish partners, Klub Szeropników, they tested a lot of different floating island prototypes. And finally, when they identified the best one, they upscaled. So this year, they constructed a lot of floating islands. This can be quite expensive, but it was necessary in this case to overcome some of the difficulties. They couldn't use the typical dam building and trench filling in this case. So I just wanted to give, an overview of very quickly of these different sites. There's a lot more. As I said, I recommend going to our project website and checking out the book that we just published. In terms of lessons learned, I want to highlight, I asked the partners to send me some of the lessons learned from implementing this project. One key one that I can highlight is, of course, as Paul and everyone in these presentations have mentioned, collaboration is key. Engaging with different peatland experts, sharing experiences, but not only with experts in different projects, but also engaging with peatland stakeholders, with local authorities, with local residents. All of that is essential. It really does ensure a much more effective and restoration and more in the long term also. They also mentioned, full stakeholder agreements prior to implementation. This is key. This is very important. It also can help not only, as I mentioned, with the longevity, the long-term effect of maintaining the long-term effect of the restoration, but also in terms of sometimes overcoming obstacles when you are implementing the restoration. Problems can arise if you have a good relationship with local stakeholders, if you have prior agreements, everything becomes easier. Another issue that a lot of our partners mention and that we all experience really is the bureaucracy involved. So as I mentioned, it's very time consuming, it's costly, and this is directly related to maybe a lot of the countries, they need an update in the national legislations because currently it's easier to keep drainage systems or to build new ones than it is to undo them. And in the example of Estonia that our partners mentioned, it's actually prohibited to raise the water level in protected areas. So clearly these legislations, they need to be updated to be able to face the current challenges that we have. And then also the challenge of the multi-use peatlands. So here we know that peatland restoration doesn't always mean no use, as we've seen in the other presentations, but the business as usual cannot continue. You have to adapt, you have to change the ways that you use it. And this is the current challenge that we have, is how to motivate farmers to change their ways. But already a lot of the speakers here mentioned there's a lot going on in that regard. We have the initiative, the Carbon Farming Initiative. I hope that will give good mechanisms to motivate farmers, because that's currently, the way I see it, the great challenge. Because as we all know, to reach carbon neutrality, we have to restore a lot of peatlands. According to Greifswald-Meyer Center, that's the estimate. It's 50 million hectares globally, 15 million at the EU level. That means, around 500,000 hectares per year. And just to put it into perspective, our project, Life Peat Restore, we restored over 5,000 in 5 years. So as I mentioned, we need to update national legislations. We need to come up with, there's a lot of mechanisms that are being implemented to try to motivate farmers, because we really need to upscale and streamline peatland restoration, especially when you consider the added challenges that climate change will bring, which will make it harder to restore with droughts and all of that. So we really need to start now and upscale as much as possible. And we have challenge ahead of us, because the lower hanging fruits, the easy ones, we've done them already. If you saw, most of the sites are Natura 2000. So we really need to start reaching the farmers and reaching the private landowners. And that's really where the challenge lies. But I think as we mentioned in most of the presentations here, collaboration, that is key. That is what we've been doing. And this project, the Life Multi-Peat, is actually a product of that collaboration. And this is something that was enabled by the group here, the group that is hosting us right now, the Peatland Restoration Management Group. It's through these engagement with the different experts, with different peatland projects and organizations, that we can continue to build on the efforts and on the experience that we all gain and share. In this case, this project is really a result of working of building on this group, actually. And here I don't have much time, so I just want to highlight the EU-wide toolkit to catalog peatlands projects and policies and data. This is a very natural flow from the group and growing. The idea is that this toolkit is just the result of this group. And this will be a digital platform. It hopefully will lead to even more collaboration and more cohesive collaboration, where we can really build on the shared experience of the different projects. We will collect a lot of data, a lot of key information and experience, and put it all in one platform. So I don't know how much time I have. I probably already talked too much. I will end it here, just to say I'm very excited about this new project and this action in particular, this EU-wide toolkit. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Letitia. Very, very, very interesting stuff, very exciting. I didn't know some of those things about the new project in particular. And I just want to point out that a couple of years ago, we had a meeting in Italy, and Letitia had these t-shirts that said, make Peatlands wet again. And I really think that's a great thing for a t-shirt. It's the best thing I've seen on a t-shirt in many years. Make Peatlands wet again. Okay, with that in mind, I'm now going to turn it over to Eurosite now, to Wojtek Moors, who's going to say something from the Eurosite point of view. He's the man that's organized all this, and he has something to say in a short film to show us.
Okay, thanks a lot, Paul, for introducing me. I'm Wojtek Mróz from the European Land Conservation Network, Eurosite, and I'm very glad to speak to you directly from Glasgow, from COP26, from our Peatland pavilion. and great to see here both online audience or people here in person. So I would like to say many thanks to our hosts here, to Global Peatlands Initiative and a number of other organizations that participated in creation of this great place to disseminate knowledge about peatlands, their restoration and their importance in climate mitigation challenges. So I will try to move forward. So Eurosite is a kind of, let's say, umbrella organization, and the question is what we stand for, or what these guys here, what you can see on the picture, what they are talking about, and why they are there somewhere, probably on the peatland. So we are trying to provide opportunities for practitioners to network and exchange experience on practical site management since 1989. So more than 30 years we are working together with practitioners, with landowners, with different kind of organizations. And before I go to a kind of summary of our today's discussion, I would like to show you a short video that was just created after our first live event after lockdown in Ireland, but you will see it on your screen in a minute.
There are colors, and the chamber is put on top of the colors, and they are measuring CO2. But you should be looking at nitrous oxide, methane, and dissolved organic carbon, and that's not taken into account here. But to get this
man-made climate warming is looming, with all the consequences for humanity. On top of that, our health and food supply is directly threatened by losing biodiversity and resilient ecosystems. Green nature-based solutions tackling such issues have the charm to be effective, cost-conscious, sustainable, and bring back lost biodiversity.
So through Eurosite and the network that it has across various European countries, we've come together, shared our experience, had an argument or two, and learned a lot more about the problems that we need to solve.
It's encouraging and disheartening at the same time to see what's possible and already accomplished and what's gone for good.
It was originally over 1,000 hectares. It's now about 440 hectares. All of that was cut away by local people.
The complex structures of bogs, their ecology and precious habitats, and their vital role for the surrounding areas are discussed by the participants. However, at the center of everything is the role peatlands must play in our fight against climate emergency.
So the Natural Climate Buffer Study Tour is a collection of various different national park organisations, scientific organisations, community groups and NGOs from across Europe who all come together every second or third year to visit sites that are of real importance for the fight against climate change.
Much of the great work that has been done to restore peatlands in Ireland and elsewhere in Europe are often initiated and accomplished by local volunteers and a few professional experts. For the urgently needed acceleration of peatlands restoration, such a situation is not sustainable.
Climate mitigation like carbon sequestration or water retention or flood attenuation or even cultural or amenity values. And by taking all of these people together, visiting various sites, we learn from each other and can bring those lessons back to our own national parks to hopefully make a larger difference together.
Everyone involved in this study tour agreed that community involvement is critical to restoring peatlands to wet and healthy habitats. This stops their greenhouse gas emissions and turns them into carbon intakers. But communities can't be left in the cold in the fight against the climate emergency. There's much more political and societal support needed. We have no time to waste.
Thank you. As you can see, I wanted to start from this video to show that the essence of our networking, of our work, is just to go there, to meet people on ground, and to discuss what could be done, how we can implement it, and bring our often great ideas to life. Not only to life projects, but in different kind of initiatives. And as you can see now, Eurosite includes members from 23 countries all over Europe. And we've got 76 members. These are organizations, also individual members, both governmental and non-governmental institutions. And we are cooperating closely with International Land Conservation Network, hosted by Lincoln Institute. We are involved in UN Global Peatlands Initiative, this organization that brings us together here today. So we are focusing on networking, communication, biodiversity conservation projects, like, for example, like this LIFE projects, Interreg and Horizon projects. So we focus also on ecosystem restoration, Natura 2000 site management, and generally management of other protected areas. And our secretariat is based in the Netherlands, in Tilburg. And we've got a lot of different working groups focused on different topics connected with nature conservation. But as you can see, one of these groups is Care-Peat, Peatland Restoration and Management Group. That group organized today's session. There are also groups on wetlands and climate change, on remote sensing, European management planning, economics and ecosystem services, and agriculture and biodiversity. And what you can see, all of these working groups are somehow connected also with peatland management, but this particular group is focused directly on restoration and management, thinking about the role of peatlands. So, to summarize our today's meeting and discussion, the question is what we can do for peatland restoration. That's the question mark. I put here the other word, conservation, because what I feel deeply in my heart, that we should start from maintaining all of well-preserved peatlands. So first is to preserve what we've got, already have, because this is a very important carbon storage resource. And later we can think, and we do that, we can think about restoring degraded peatlands and to support rewetting and paludiculture. But I put here as the beginning, however, our group focuses on restoration and management, but conservation, maintenance of what is well maintained is very, very important, and it is the first step. So, how can we maintain and restore our peatlands? We should have an impact on policy and decision makers. But thinking about its conservation first, but you've heard it in Niall's Brolcháin presentation that with all of these projects we are trying to make this impact stronger. And for example, in one of these new live projects in Multi-Peat, we are focusing on establishment of European peatland policy working group. And we would like also to attract investors and public money. With help of such great initiative like Global Peatlands Initiative, we would like to mobilize researchers to find optimal technical solutions. And you've seen it. We got a lot of great researchers in our Interreg Care-Peat project, and they are spending a lot of time to find how could we approach these difficult questions, what technologies we could use to restore our peatlands. And we would like to implement all of these great ideas together with stakeholders and local communities. And it was also underlined by Terry in his presentation that we would like to cooperate with landowners, also with private landowners, because it is also the very important stakeholder group that could help us in our conservation targets. And we would like to later to maintain the results of all of these projects by implementation of business models like carbon farming, carbon credits, also mentioned by Niall, and we will do that in our live multi-pit project. And finally, we would like to cooperate closer on pan-European scale, and I put here not this word pan-European because as you can see on that map on the other side, majority of European peatlands are not only in the in European Union but also in other European countries, especially in Eastern Europe, in these countries like Belarus or Ukraine. So it is very important to gather all of these countries, both from the European Union and other countries, to cooperate closer on peatland conservation and restoration, and on 12 exactly here in this pavilion there be another event to discuss this closer cooperation and thinking about launching of European Peatlands Initiative collaboration. It will be an open discussion, just we are trying to bring all different, the most important organizations that are important for peatland restoration in Europe to discuss and to find a way how could we boost our efforts on peatlands restoration in Europe. So if you would have any more questions about Care-Peat Restoration and Management Group, you can write to Paul Leadbitter, the chair of the group and the chair of our today's meeting. You can write me, or you can visit our website, Eurosite.org, or you can contact us at email info@eurosite.org. So now I would like to pass the floor to Paul to start our Q&A discussion, and I've seen that there are quite a lot of different questions in Q&A. So thanks a lot, and stay with us for something like 10 or 15 minutes for final discussion about these topics that we tackled during today's meeting. Thanks a lot.
So Wojtek, I just want to confirm, how much time do we have for questions? Okay. How much time do we have for questions, Wojtek?
I couldn't hear you, but you can see the questions in Q&A. There are a lot of them. You can start just answering and...
Okay, I'm not sure how much time we have left. So I'll go with the first one. This is for Niall. And is the funding afforded to B&M for rehabilitation, 108 million euros, not a form of additionality?
You're supposed to give the hard ones to Terry, but anyway, is it not a form of additionality? Obviously, it's been accepted by the government. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, 108 million euros has been funded for re-wetting. I personally think that, I talked about the paradox of additionality. The fact is we have to restore that land, and it's the money has been put forward, and I think everybody who knows anything about peatlands or is involved in the whole situation knows that that is the land. It's been very badly abused land, and to be honest with you, I think that's the wrong question, really. I think the fact is that land is the key land to be restored, and I'm very glad that funding has been allocated to it.
Something we hear a lot about in England is that some people feel the additionality thing is unnecessary and they're fighting against it. So I think there's a lot of questions to see how that plays out. Okay, one for Terry then, please. Terry, what are the main barriers for private landowners to work on peatland restoration?
I think having the confidence, I think there's fears associated with landowners, in particular where you have landscapes where there are multiple landowners situated together, that the re-wetting on one or several properties may or may not influence or impact the adjacent landowner. And so I think an important thing for landowners is to allay those fears of lateral impact. Of course, every site's different, every peatland's different, how it responds to restoration. So it does need to be done on a site-by-site basis. But I think that's the biggest fear, and I think once they understand that it's not going to end up flooding all the other adjacent lands, then I think we'll have more people come on. So we need pilot sites that show that and demonstrate that.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I agree. In England, one of the biggest barriers is it's private landowners own everything, and it's the relationship you have with them, the trust you build with them over the years. They're absolutely essential because they own the land. So the barriers can be many, from not wanting to do it, period, worried about what it means in the future, and sometimes they feel it might impact their agri-environment scheme payments, et cetera, et cetera. So still lots of work to do on that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now this is one for Letitia. If cooperation with the agricultural sector is first needed to upscale to larger scale restoration, how can this be reached?
Well, we've seen here already lots of, from the presentation from Niall, for example, there are mechanisms to motivate the participation of farmers. And in our own new project, the Life Multi-Peat project, we will be following the advice of Terry and having some pilot areas where we will show that we can restore and there will be a core area where we will restore to surface level, but then there is another area where we will allow paludiculture, and we want to engage with farmers and show them that it works and that you can make money out of it, and kind of try to overcome that fear of the change of doing something different that they haven't done before. So that's how we have to upskill, showing them that it works.
Great, thank you. Okay, here's an interesting one, perhaps controversial. Did the EU projects tear down forests and landscapes where there was peat before trees? Anybody?
I might just, I don't know if I give a totally correct answer to that, but I mean, there are projects going ahead in Ireland where trees are being removed on peatlands. You know, it's an interesting question, but you know, the relationship between trees and peatlands is a very important one, and quite clearly trees cannot be planted in, you know, planting trees and draining peatlands is a nonsense from a climate point of view. Now, I don't know if that's what the question is really getting at. I think it's about European projects destroying landscapes, but in the main, I don't think there's too many examples of that actually happening, to be honest. But I do think that there's a lot of cases now of peatlands being properly restored in the case where there were inappropriate forestry, and there's going to have to be a lot more of that.
Yeah. In the UK, we have massive targets for tree planting, and especially in the north of England, people look to this open landscape for places to plant trees, and it's not that simple. Okay, next question then. Are payments for peatland restoration and credits linked, staggered, or do they have a long-term payoff?
Anybody else want to answer that?
No, this is for you.
This is for you, Neil.
The interesting thing is the way it's happened to date. It's quite generally they'd be sort of 50-year projects, and you know, there's a question mark about whether they are going to all have to conclude by 2050, which I think is a very interesting question. But the interesting thing is they tend to sell out very quickly, and we've seen in both the Netherlands and Germany that you know, the full 50 years have been sold out, to be quite frank. So I mean, good peatland restoration projects are very, very popular from a financial point of view. So I certainly don't think that finance is going to be the big barrier. I think sort of the way that they're structured, you know, and that we can get enough projects actually into the frameworks. We really do need our governments to come forward and make sure that proper frameworks for allowing this to happen on a long-term basis are put in place urgently. And the European Commission is not the one who's found wanting on this. That's what they want to happen. I think they're making a big announcement this year on that one. So let's look forward to this, because I think we're going to find things are going to happen very, very quickly in this regard.
Okay, thank you. And then one for everybody, probably. This is one I think we all struggle with, but are there any good resources for secondary education teachers interested in linking work on peatland use and restoration to curriculum and how it relates to products being consumed in urban settings?
Ooh, in
That is-
Ireland,
that is a hard one.
yeah, in Ireland, I know the Irish Peatland Conservation Council has some resources. Geez, that would seem to, we would need to, there's need to have to actually bring those types of resources together, because that is an excellent question and something that would be very helpful. I know that as far as Care-Peat, we will be producing farmer fact sheets for farmers for re-wetting, and that's forthcoming. But existing mechanisms, I would say, in Ireland, go to the Irish Peatland Conservation Council. I don't know about the UK or other countries.
Yeah, and I would ask my partners also in the Baltic countries to have their very peatland rich countries, if it's part of the module at at the kid level kind of school. I do know that they themselves organize a lot of events with children and with schools to explain the importance of peatlands, but that's at NGO level.
Yeah, I mean, I found my children, yeah, in that picture, a bit older now, but when they were at primary school, a lot of the kids who live in this area, I can see a peatland across from where I live right now. They didn't know that was a peatland. You have to know it's something before you can be aware of it and be concerned about it. So they're teaching the kids in school about rainforests, which is great, but there's a peatland next door, and this is a 1,000 square kilometer peatland. So there's a need to tap into the schools, isn't there, in your local area? And I'm quite keen to develop a sense of pride with children to know that that's a busting machine, or with a climate change busting machine that they could, get involved with. So there's a need to get into the schools, and perpetually, I think we have to continue to try and educate and get people aware of these things. Okay, got one more because we've got 2 minutes left, and that would be, let's see, what. This is about the methane issue. What about the methane issue from the vegetated area with cotton grass? We have that issue brought in our attention all the time. When you re-wet, there's a methane spike. I think this might have been one for Terry, perhaps. Is that?
Sure. Yeah. So cotton grass is known during re-wetting to be a source of methane. And so really, as I said before, every site's different, and how it responds and the vegetation that comes back will be slightly different. There is this Goldilocks zone that we've talked about in other conferences about getting the hydrology. And so management of hydrology for any kind of wetland system, peatlands in particular, is crucial. And what you want to do is try to target that so that you don't have an inundated surface that's a methane source, and not too far below the surface to where you have other species that are coming in that aren't quite hydrophilic or wetland loving plants. So yeah, in the case of the cotton grass, perhaps with Chris's work in Manchester, that probably would be a short-term methane spike, but in the longer run, those things, once organic matter starts to accumulate again, overall will be a greenhouse gas sink.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm being told our time is up, so thank you. There are more questions here. I imagine they will be captured somehow through this system, so they'll be there. If you want to get in touch with anybody else about these presentations, please contact me or Eurosite, and we can direct you to anything you need to. Thank you for the speakers very much, and thank you for the people in the audience listening to us. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.